try to do this more regularly, where we just kind of dig in a little more, have a conversation about the messages and kind of the series, especially this one that is on the book of Ruth. And so tell us about our journey a little bit in this book and kind of how this came about.
The journey thus far, taking a look at the book of Ruth, looking at a specific narrative in the scriptures, and while trying not to make Ruth's story or Naomi's story be our story, but finding ourselves within the context of what they were walking through in the time that they were living, as Naomi specifically was part of the people of God, Ruth was not, how that relates to our story, our journeys along the way of following Jesus.
Yeah, it's been good. Sawyer and I, for a bit, have been kind of considering the story and walking through it, and the way we do kind of series and working through things here at Bethel typically is through a book of the Bible or through a passage in the scripture, kind of long term. And as we were considering the story, it's a short book, 4 chapters, and yet, man, the depths of the richness there. And so God's been working in our own lives as we've been working through this, and kind of taught us some things, and we're excited to share really with our church and with our body about how we see God working even in our lives today. And so we started kind of in the beginning. We called this series Go, and Christy and I shared about sometimes you don't really see the little things happening as they're happening, but when you look back and then you see all that God has done, it's amazing, both good and bad, right?
Yeah.
In Ruth and Naomi's story, the 10 years in Moab or more, and then looking back and seeing all the heartache and the pain, and probably in the moment you don't know and experience it, right?
Yeah.
It's like picking up little things as you go, and next thing you know, you got this big old burden, and you can't carry it anymore. It's like having a rock in your shoe.
Yeah.
You eventually got to stop and take the rock out.
Yeah.
So excited to work through this. So then the second week, we actually just read through the story, and that was a lot of fun. Sawyer and I back and forth, very little commentary, reading through the story. So we encourage you to read the book of Ruth. If you haven't read it, just read it from start to finish. It's a great story. It's a short story, but super impactful.
Yeah.
So week 3 actually that you shared, what was the main gist of the message you shared? Our streaming didn't work that day, and so we have this thing of we trust God. Technology is technology, gremlins are gremlins, whatever they are in our stuff, and so we trust that God knows what He's doing, but we also want to do our best, and so we're really don't want to leave that one hanging, and so we thought this would be a good time to kind of recap what you had shared that day.
Yeah, so the beginning of the book of Ruth, diving back in after we read the whole story, week 2, diving in week 3, starting back at the beginning and working our way slowly through it. The beginning of Ruth opens up with such a tense, stressful, bitter place. And so I really felt like God was inviting us as we jumped into the story at the beginning to cultivate awareness. I spent some time inviting us into seeing the beginning of this story in that way of cultivating awareness in our own lives using Ruth's story. And I spent a lot of time talking about honesty. Like, I have 4 questions that we talked about week 3, and I said it's not going to do us any good if we're not going to be honest about them and take the time to actually approach the questions and really sit with them. And so the 4 questions were: where are you? What is your condition? What do you hear? And where are you going? And again, this was all to really, if you want to view it as a farmer or a planter, somebody who works in the garden, getting their hands in the soil and kind of breaking up some rough dirt clods or some areas of the soil that need some tending. Rocks. It's to really use these questions to do that, get our hands into it, and locate ourselves in regard to following Christ. And
so the 4 questions are really powerful that we're just going to continue through the series, because I really think those 4 questions that God gave you as you've been looking through this are the essence of taking Scripture and then using it as a mirror for us to reflect, right?
Yeah.
So I see this in Scripture, where am I? So that first question, where are you? The story of Ruth obviously takes place in different locations, different scenarios, and really being able to pause and say, where are you? I think back to the garden with God and the Adam and Eve, and the question He asked was not a condemning one. He's like, where are you? And I think throughout Scripture there's this whisper or this invitation over and over again for us to pause and actually look around and say, where am I? And it could be embarrassing. It could be vulnerable.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
could be like, I'm doing great. I'm over here serving. I'm doing awesome.
Yeah.
But where are you is a really important place to start. Great first question. And then following up with it is, okay, now I know where I am. Why I am. What's my condition? So Ruth and Naomi were in Moab. For Ruth, this was home,
Yeah.
right? But for Naomi, it was her new home. So where did she find her condition? What was she?
Ruth specifically, I mean, we didn't get quite into it in week 3, but just a daughter-in-law of a widow. Naomi comes to Moab with a husband and 2 sons who eventually marry, and she's about to pick up and go back to Bethlehem or the house of bread. She's got 2 daughters-in-law. So Ruth finds herself connected relationally and in love with a woman who's a widow, no sons, no means of provision. So she
And
finds
she
her place
herself
in
a
a very
widow.
interesting,
Yeah.
beginning. Yeah.
So tough. So the condition, and I think putting it into our today, I think a lot of us in our community, in our jobs, in our families, we're really just kind of going through the motions and don't really pause to ask ourselves, okay, so where am I? And what's my condition? Am I tired? Am I stressed? Am I overburdened? Am I traumatized? Am I radicalized? I mean, you could ask yourself a whole bunch of questions, especially in our day and age. If we don't pause and ask the condition of the soil of our hearts every so often, we might find ourselves in a bitter place,
Yeah.
which is where Naomi found herself, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think the what's your condition, when we're talking about being honest, it's really those first 2 questions that I feel requires the most honesty. I mean, all of them require it, but like these will put the it's definitely an intense moment to be honest with yourself about these 2 things. Where am I, and what is my condition?
Do I need a nap? Am I hungry?
Yes.
Am I overweight? I mean, there's so many things
Yeah.
about my condition. I was talking to a guy today, and he was talking. I asked him what he's been learning in his 60s and how God has been using this time, and what can he tell me that I'm about to enter my 50s? And he goes, well, one thing that I just need to tell you is make sure you take care of your body, because it will heal slower. You'll be tired. You won't bend as well as you did. So taking care of your joints, and it's like that's a condition that's like honesty of like, okay, I'm in my 60s, and what's my condition?
Yeah.
So there's this question really relates to so many
All
facets
areas,
of
yeah.
life. And then when you bring it into spiritually, what do we find spiritually in Naomi? Let's leave Ruth aside for a minute, but what do we find spiritually that Naomi would pause and be like, where am I? I'm away from home in Moab. What's my condition? What did she find?
Yeah, I believe Naomi, outside of the practicality of no husband, no sons, left in a strange land, geographically, I think she also felt abandoned by God,
Yeah.
alone. She was vulnerable. You would even say weak. A woman during that time with no husband or sons to care for her was just it's kind of a scary place to be.
Yeah.
So
And I think her story is a lot of our stories, which is if we don't pause to ask our condition where we are, it'll lead to bitterness. And I've met a lot of people, I've been there myself, where just the chaos of life or the storms of life or just the not dealing with things leads to a type of bitterness like, I didn't deserve this. Why did I lose this? God did this to me. And actually she mentions later on in the passage there that God has tormented me, which the original language is judged me.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of us, if we don't deal with it, like where we are, condition, we can end up bitter. And I do think that's a powerful thing to ask about our condition. We have a thing we've just now come across, which is, pain or discomfort not dealt with will be transmitted or transferred. And I think we see that in her life. We see that in Naomi's life. How did her condition affect Ruth, though?
It's interesting as we dig into the story and see that Ruth was determined. She wasn't deterred, but she actually found herself determined to follow Naomi for some reason. Back to even in Naomi's bitterness, there was something in that relationship and over 10 years.
Even
maybe
a spark there.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. And so I think we shouldn't overlook that we may be in a valley or a storm or find ourselves in a really stressful, even bitter condition. Others around us can still find hope in us.
Yeah.
Like something there would make us take one more step
Yes,
forward.
yeah.
And I think we see that in Naomi's story. So, I actually, reading through this so many times and looking at the whole thing, it's almost like maybe this should be called the story of Naomi.
Yeah.
We call it the story of Ruth because of the consequence, but I kind of wonder if she might be the primary character in the story
Yeah.
because she wraps up the story too.
Yeah.
So really a fascinating thing. So the two other questions, once you know where you are, condition, and then it's like, what do you hear? What do you mean by that? Like, what are you talking about specifically when you said, what do you hear?
Yeah, what do you hear? So in the story, Naomi heard, we don't even get 7 verses in, and Naomi heard that the Lord had blessed the crops of Judah again, or had returned favor to the land. And so the question was a provoking of, can you even hear? When's the last? I use that as an opportunity to really be honest with myself and invite others into. When's the last time you've stopped to listen? And what do you hear? Just can you hear? What do you hear? And what are you going to do with that? Which is going to head into the next question. But the what do you hear was really a peculiar question to ask. And I know that week 3 we did spend some time towards the end of the message in kind of maybe some awkward silence for some, but it was a listening time, what we call listening prayer, of just being able to look at any of these questions that are coming up, specifically the what do you hear, spending some time listening, to hear what God's saying in the midst of our stories.
Well, human nature, I think about this, and our human nature, the way God designed us, we have 5 senses. We have a spiritual sense, so let's say there's 6 senses, but the 5 senses, if you're in pain, the other senses shut down. If you're, my thing is if I'm watching something or if I'm on my phone, I can't hear. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I can't hear you. Well, I think that's what it is. I think when you find your condition and you see where your senses are absorbed, this kind of shuts off and you just can't hear anymore. And I think directly hear from God, or maybe the goodness of God somewhere, we can only feel what we feel. And so powerful question, what do you hear? And I think as we walk through the story of Ruth, I think God's really going to speak to our church, not only individually, but as a body. What do we hear? Because we're grateful for God taking us out of Moab. We're grateful for God rescuing us and giving us new life. But we don't want to be caught up in the condition without hearing, right?
Yeah.
So 4th question, where are we going? Or where are you going?
Yeah, and I wrestled with this one on whether or not it was where are you going or what are you going to do about it? What do you hear? So where are you going based off what you're hearing, or what are you going to do? And ultimately, we can hear good news, but eventually we got to put action.
Got to take a step.
Yeah, you got to take a step, and I think that it relates in my mind to this whole conversation of the spirit and our body experiences. We like to separate those two, but they're really actually so integrated. Everything we experience is actually through our body, but we have that spiritual sense, like you said. So in the same time, we may be spending time in prayer, listening to what God is speaking, and even as a church gathered together, listening to what God's speaking, but we eventually have to do something.
It makes me think of all the knowledge, the scripture reading, maybe the book reading, the intelligence that's out there. And in the end, there's a saying in Christian church that people don't care what you know until they know how you care, or know how you care. I said it wrong, but it's not just knowing. There's something that comes from it. Knowing that the stove is hot means, okay, I'm not going to touch it. Or knowing that I've got to go over there to find peace, I've got to take some steps. And so where are you going is a powerful question, because we can even see where we are, see that we're bitter, hear from God, and just stay. That happens all the time. You get stuck, and we're stuck in the first 3 questions without action. The story of Ruth all the way through, we see all of these play out over and over again. Great questions to come up with for us to consider as we walk through the book of Ruth. And in the context of it is, remember, this is not our story. We get to telescope in and kind of be a fly on the wall of someone else's story. And it's like any good book. You kind of make yourself the character, and you feel like the character. Well, we got to remember in this one, this is not our story. But the questions and the principles of God, they are still powerful. So what did you, with those questions and then the moment of silence, where did you leave Bethel in week 3 to consider?
Yeah, week 3 was just after listening, spending some time listening, is to not leave this place without some type of action. What are you
Yeah.
what are you going to do? And really, it was just an invitation to use this whole story as the beginning of this. As we go through the rest, to remember that we're going to cultivate awareness while we're looking at this story,
Yeah.
using this story to, like I said, it's not our story, but how can this story provoke us to in our relationship with God and how we follow Jesus? But I did have an invitation at the end for those who, weren't necessarily stuck in these questions, felt like they kind of had a grip on that to maybe consider somebody who is wrestling with those. And it might be time to hook arms with somebody or put somebody on their back, per se, and say, well, let's get back on the road. And it says at the very end of verse 7 that Naomi and Ruth got on the path that would lead them back to Judah, back to the place of promise, the promised land. So maybe there's somebody else within our body or somebody who might step into somebody's life at work, school, something. And if you recognize that, maybe it's time to get on the path with them.
Super good. And I would encourage our church and those listening that you may be in a really difficult season of your life, and you may be, called to go home, back to the house of bread, maybe start from the beginning where you knew there was life. But don't overlook other people watching you and allow them to come.
Yeah.
Because I think Naomi tried to talk her daughter-in-laws out of coming, but Ruth's determination was great.
Yes.
And so you never know who's around you watching you. And so just be encouraged that even if you're in a dark season, just know God is still going to use you to make things beautiful.
Yes.
And so don't just go it alone. I think that's really the story of all of Scripture from the beginning of time is don't go it alone. It's not good for man to be alone. So grab, if someone does come along the journey, let him come, because God's going to do more than you could imagine or think. Well, then I got to come in week 4 and got to kind of look at a really big, broad view. And the way I've read through the book of Ruth and the way God's kind of led me is in these kind of 4 spaces, along with a 5th one that we'll find. But these kind of 4 spaces that we can find ourselves in. So asking the question, where are you? What is your condition? What do you hear? And then what are you going to do about it? We started for week 4 with kind of like, where was Moab? Where did Moab come from? Dark story. Its origins were really evil. And yet in that, God in his plan and in his grace still will call people from that area of evil. And so descendants down the line after Lot, through Lot came Moab and the Ammonites. So these were always a tension point with the Israelites. And so it kind of started there. You can go back and watch the whole sermon if you'd like to on our Facebook or website or YouTube. But really looking at, okay, so this was a place that they intentionally went to and were settling.
Yes.
And then all the chaos happened, death, and then the death of the sons, and then Naomi bit her, and she's like, I'm going to go back to the house of bread. Well, my perception of this is her leaving the house of bread really was a trek, and it took her some intention to get back. But this curse that God had given over the Moabites and the Ammonites was a curse that he said for 10 generations, these people aren't allowed into the assembly of the Lord. And you look at Ruth, and she's kind of like right in that time frame, and God did redeem the curse of the Ammonites and the Moabites with an open invitation. Our God is an inviting God, and he wants us to come home.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if we've left home or if we've never been to home. His arms are out, and they're broad, and they're like, just come home, sit at the table, sit at the house of bread. And so as I was walking through that, one of the things that I really spent some time on was the Moab, that place. And so we can easily say, well, Moab's in Jordan, and that's over on that plateau and all that stuff. We don't need to consider Moab as an actual physical place, even though it is. We need to consider Moab as a place of our current experience, and we can ask ourselves, am I in Moab right now? Have I left the house of bread? Have I walked away from God, or have I made some drifting decisions that I didn't really mean to, but I find myself kind of setting up shop or house somewhere, And so that was my kind of overall. But right in the middle of the sermon, this powerful word just kind of rocked me, and it's the word hesed in Hebrew. And so hesed, what does hesed mean?
God's, it's a word used to describe the loving kindness, the faithfulness of God.
Yeah.
Compassion. I think of in Deuteronomy and in other places, actually quite a few places in Scripture, describing the Lord as full of compassion, slow to anger. So I feel like this word in particular kind of begins to capture this idea that really can't be expressed in one word.
Right. Yeah, and it's the backbone of all of Scripture, but really the story of Ruth, it's kind of this unseen skeleton in the story. It's mentioned 3 times. This Hebrew word has said, not a great English translation, but there's a bunch of words that describe it.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a posture, it's almost like an attitude, it's almost like a culture that you can't really touch, but you can feel it. That's the loving kindness of God. And he declares this is who he is, and he invites us into that hesed, into that home. And so really sitting on that in week 4 was the idea of it doesn't matter how far, it doesn't matter how dark, it doesn't matter how unforgivable, in quotations, things can become, God's hesed is calling us home.
That's good.
His hesed is calling us back. And so what's interesting about this word, when it's used in chapter 1, it's Naomi describing her daughters-in-law. So it's not describing Naomi, it's not describing Moab, it's actually her understanding that loving kindness that seems unimaginable, she saw it in her daughters-in-law.
Yeah.
And she saw it both in Orpah and in Ruth. So how does that strike you when you hear Naomi describing her daughters-in-law that way?
Well, it's beautiful. I mean, you just said it's beautiful that, she has this view of God as having turned his back on her and judged her, and yet she's got these 2 young ladies who she says, may the Lord reward you. So may the Lord that has basically turned his back on me, may he reward you. So there's something intricate going on there.
Confusing.
For your loving kindness, for your faithfulness, for her to identify in both these women. Even though Orpah eventually turns back, it's like she was able to see with these 2 women, there was this element of like, not just like, oh, I love you until things get hard. It was, they got on the road with her and we're going to head back. And so she said, may the Lord reward you for your faithful love to me, even after my sons have died, knowing that I have nothing for you. You stay close.
And we have to consider people in our lives. I think it's surprising the people around us that have shown godly kindness to us, and they didn't even know God.
Yeah.
And we automatically categorize people sometimes as Christians as like, oh, that's a good person, that's a bad person, and the only difference is they know God. But actually, when you can step back and look at God's master plan, even his goodness shows up in the unbeliever towards us. And so I would encourage us during this week just to look around and see the people in your life that are showing hesed to you, that are actually showing some otherly kindness that you can't quite describe. Because I wonder if God doesn't use those to soften this bitterness that's in us, right? Because we may feel betrayed, judged, rejected, and yet there's always that person. We should never do things alone. We should always realize that we don't get where we are by ourselves, and we're not going to get out by ourselves.
Yeah.
And so who around us is that picture of loving kindness? And I this week in particular, I've made it a point, and I've had 3 opportunities to actually tell someone, hey, you meant a lot to me during this season, and I'm going to tell you why. You were God's love for me in that season. And every person that I've told has been like, you're crazy, but it truly was meaningful. Like, I didn't get here by myself. Yeah. And no matter how much we think we're islands, we're not, you know. So it's always together. It's always something there. So so Moab promised a bunch of things to Naomi and her family. And really the result, as we see the story, was just death, sorrow, bitterness, sadness, right? Yeah. So what's the invitation of God, I mean, to us in his hesed that's almost indescribable? What is his invitation truly that we see even played out in Naomi and Ruth's life?
Yeah, his invitation, we said it when we read through the whole book the first week. The phrase that stood out to me was just simply God is faithful. And whether you're looking at the macro or the micro, the whole story of Scripture, this one story within it, there's this invitation to trust his faithfulness and to remain in the place of his promise, even as we're working out the other areas that we'll get to throughout the next few weeks. Kind of work through more of those dirt clods or those stones or that rough ground, that hard ground. Is just I feel like the invitation is to trust that loving faithfulness.
It's good. So, and I wonder if the invitation of God is, I've got so much more for you, but until you come home, you're not going to see it.
Yeah.
And it's not an indictment. It's just the truth. You know, you can't know the whole story, because if you do, you wouldn't need to read it.
Yeah.
But something about that first step, back to these questions, is like, there's more, and I want to encourage our church family, our community, there's more. And that's why we're walking through this, because just coming to the house of bread is a great step, and it feels so good. And coming home is incredible. It's that warm embrace of family you haven't seen in a long time, and yet there's so much more.
Yes.
And so he doesn't leave us just sitting in the house of bread getting fat, right?
Yes, yeah.
He's got so much more. And so not to give anything away, but what is something we can look forward to as we walk through Ruth in the coming weeks, months, years? I don't know how long this is going to take,
Yeah.
so we don't have a plan of ending. But
Yeah, like I said, the story starts so not how we normally, think a story would start. Usually, once upon a time, this was taking place, and it's this great moment, and then tragedy happens, but we just open up into the tragedy.
yeah, it's like real.
And I think something we have to look forward to as we kind of paint the rest of the picture throughout the book is that we're going to be able to understand just a little bit more, even if it's just 1 degree more of understanding that loving faithfulness and the rest and the trust that can come if we embrace that process of kind of working through some of these questions in our lives. And even as we get back to the place of bread, back to the place of promise, that trusting God as He brings stuff up to work in our hearts, I think we have a lot to look forward to in just enjoying His loving faithfulness, like enjoying God.
What I want to encourage everybody to do is, as we look forward to this, don't stop reading Ruth. Just read it, because every time you read it, you'll see something a little different.
That's right.
God will whisper something to you different, and the loving kindness of God is just throughout. And we ended this past Sunday, week 4, with our body repeating together, His love endures forever, His kindness endures forever. And it's like that's the reminder as we go, because not only did it affect Naomi, Ruth, the community, but then for generations. And it's this not a backbone that becomes just the full body. It's a beautiful thing. And we get to live as a result of Ruth and Naomi's life. So because Naomi came home and because Ruth came with her, we're sitting here today, thousands of years later, because of that act of coming home.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
It just takes me back to the beginning of our series, you and Christy sharing with us just the little piece of your guys' history in Costa Rica, not knowing in the midst. I think you probably had glimpses and could see God working, but 10 years later, more than that probably, you're looking back going like, I would have never guessed. And, we look at Naomi and Ruth, I'm sure she didn't know. She probably, there's got to be something within her that remembered who God is and the story that she would have heard recited to her probably of Him bringing them out of, nothing into something. And it just is an encouragement to us to know that even when we don't understand, get on the road and look to Him and ask Him to reveal that loving faithfulness to you. And then I'm sure we're going to all be able to look back and be like, wow.
Yeah. So. And I think Naomi gets real excited once you get really far into the story. I don't think the first half, she was just home at the house of bread. And so excitedly looking at this story, as Sawyer said, starts dark, gloom, despair, and it just goes from there. And it's a beautiful redemption story. So it's not our story, but man, it feels like ours. And so thanks for tuning in. We'll see you Sunday for Multi-Gen, and then we'll pick this back up.
Yeah.
So
Sounds
awesome.
good.
Thanks, Sawyer. Appreciate
All right,
it.
you bet.